session of our forum on taking care of strangers, comparing Asian and Jewish moral traditions. We had two talks this morning, first by Professor Daniel Frank from Purdue University about the Jewish tradition, and then by Jianjun He, one of our own Chinese studies faculty members here, who talked about Chinese attitudes toward foreigners in the ancient past. We're very pleased to have as our keynote speaker this afternoon Professor Haiyan Lee, who is Associate Professor of Chinese and Comparative Literature at Stanford University. Professor Lee was born in China, but has studied here in the United States, and then taught at the University of Colorado Boulder, and then at the University of Hong Kong, before getting her job at Stanford in 2009. Her first book, Revolution of the Heart, A Genealogy of Love in China, 1900 to 1950, she describes as a critical genealogy of the idea of love, Cheng, is that how you pronounce it, in modern Chinese literary and cultural history, and it received the Joseph Levinson Prize in the field of modern Chinese literature. Her second book just appeared a few months ago and is entitled The Stranger and the Chinese Moral Imagination, and the title alone indicates why we thought she was the perfect keynote speaker for our program today, raising this question of the treatment of strangers and what it has to do with the opening of, with Shanghai's taking in these 18,000 Jewish refugees during the Second World War. In her book, she examines how the figure of the stranger, the foreigner, the migrant, the class enemy, the woman, the animal, the ghost, appears in Chinese fiction, film, television, and exhibition culture, how these representations test the moral limits of a society known for the primacy, she says, of consanguinity and familiarity. And she's now starting on a new project on Chinese visions of justice. So we're very happy to welcome you here today, Professor Lee, and we look forward very much to your talk. Let's escape from this PowerPoint. And, which one is yours? This one? No.
The one at the bottom of my picture.
Oh, okay. Then your picture. There it is.
Oh, yeah, that's it.
Okay. And thanks to the wonders of technology. There we go. Okay.
So, thank you, Professor Popkin, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to Lexington. It's really delightful to be here at last. I'm terribly sorry for missing this morning's events. When you are stuck in an airport hotel for a night with just your pocketbook, it gives you a lot of time for reflection. And indeed, being sort of stranded in a huge and bustling airport really makes you appreciate the kindness of strangers. Anyone who cares to listen to your tale of woe or give you a word of advice, they're just such a darling to you. And but this morning, everything went smoothly. I'm happy to report. And I met the speakers at lunch, had a wonderful conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to launch into my talk. Excuse me. As some of you know, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, tens of thousands of European Jews fleeing Nazi genocide found a temporary safe home in Shanghai, China. They were able to do so for two reasons. One, Shanghai was an open city under divided governance. And two, China was at war with Japan, and could not enforce border control. So in this talk, I'm going to reflect on the moral lessons of this somewhat fortuitous episode of humanitarianism through the lens of moral philosophy and moral psychology. I'm going to start with a story. In fact, this is actually the synopsis of a novel written by the Chinese-Canadian writer Haiyan Lee. The English title of the novel is A Jewish Piano, but the Chinese title is 魔咒钢琴, or a cursed piano. This is a tragic love story set against the background of the Jewish exodus from the Third Reich and the refugee experience in Shanghai. And it's the male protagonist, Adam, is Jewish, a Polish Jew, and also an accomplished pianist. So at the beginning of the novel, he and his wife, Vera, have fled occupied Poland and are now living in exile in Leningrad. The female protagonist, May, is a Chinese student studying music in Leningrad. She is the orphaned daughter of Red Army fighters sent to Russia under the auspices of the Comintern, or the Third Communist International. If you've never heard of this, it's okay, you can Google it. Anyhow, so by perchance, May and Adam, they meet, and a romance blossoms out of their shared love for classical music. They jointly compose a romantic concerto on Adam's beloved grand piano, the piano of the title. And then they proceed to a passionate love affair. Never mind that he's married, and she has a fiancé also studying in Leningrad. And then, come 1941, the German army begins its encirclement of Leningrad, and May convinces the Jewish leadership to take his people to evacuate to Shanghai, where you don't need a visa, and where there's already a thriving Jewish community. So they all board the Trans-Siberia Rail and eventually arrive in Shanghai. Adam and Vera move into a very dingy apartment in Hong Kong, also known as Little Vienna. And of course, they struggle to adjust to the squalid conditions. And about a year later, they are then corralled into a restricted area, commonly referred to as the Jewish Ghetto, by the Japanese authorities. In the meantime, May and her fiancé are quickly transferred to a base area of the Red Army, who are also fighting the Japanese, and where May gives birth to Bo, to a son. Bo, as in Poland, which is the Chinese transliteration of Poland, and you can see where this name comes from. After May's fiancé dies on a mission, May volunteers to take over his post as an undercover operative stationed in Shanghai to procure medical supplies for the Red Army, mainly, in fact, dealing with Russian Jewish merchants. So in Shanghai, May manages to find Adam, and they have a very, very brief but passionate reunion. And this turns out to be their last meeting, and their path will never cross again. And then in 1949, Japan surrenders, and a civil war breaks out between the nationalists, the ruling nationalists, and the insurgent communists, prompting an exodus of the foreigners, including the Jews. Adam leaves for America, and he entrusts his piano, which amazingly made it all the way to Shanghai from Leningrad. He entrusts his piano to a Jewish friend for May. May eventually receives the piano. So Mei and Li Bo stay in Shanghai, and in South China, they come under a cloud of suspicion for this connection with foreigners. They are harassed and persecuted by the Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution. And then finally, Li Bo resolves to leave China and to find his father. Now I'm going to leave this part of the story to the very end of my talk. So if you want to find out if Li Bo finds his father, you're going to have to stick around to the end. But the reason, by the way, there's actually a movie being in the works loosely based on this novel. The producer, Mike Madavoy, in fact, spent his childhood as a refugee in Shanghai. And the director supposedly is going to be the director of Rain Man, and the scriptwriter is the scriptwriter of The Pianist. You probably have all seen The Pianist. I can almost see Adrian Brody playing Adam, reprising his performance as the pianist. In any case, the reason I'm telling you this story or this novel is because I want to use it to illustrate 2 points, a historical point and a moral psychological point. Excuse me. Now, there's actually a very important episode, very crucial episode in the novel that I omitted from my synopsis. And this is actually very key to my argument. That's why I'm saving it to the last. So immediately before Mei and Adam meet for the second in Shanghai, immediately before their reunion, when Mei goes to the ghetto to look for Adam, she comes face to face with the grim reality of Jewish suffering. So she resolves to help. Miraculously, she's able to raise enough funds to procure large quantities of flour, and then she commissions Chinese residents whose dwellings abut the Jewish ghetto area to bake flatbread, and then deliver all these little tiny parcels of flatbread to the Jews in the ghetto. Now, I've searched and searched, and I don't think, as far as I know, I don't think there's any historical basis for such an episode. Meaning, there's no archival evidence for organized, direct Chinese to Jewish aid in this period. Of course, we cannot rule out spontaneous acts of kindness and generosity. So this got me thinking, why does the novelist invent such a story? And I'm going to ask you to keep this story in the back of your mind, and I promise to come back to this question. Now, I'm going to quickly review the historical circumstances of the Jewish refugee experience. And by looking at Shanghai more closely. So Shanghai, for about 100 years, from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, is the epitome of what Mao has called the semi-colonial condition, meaning China was never formally colonized by any of the European powers, but China could not and did not exercise full sovereign control over its territories. So that's the semi part. And this, in Chinese nationalist historiography, is an enormous black spot, deeply seared into the Chinese national memory. Excuse me. And so that's one very important circumstance we need to keep in mind. The other one is in 1937, Japan launched a full-scale war of invasion against China. And Japan quickly rendered the ruling nationalist regime prostrate, leaving it in no position to exercise border control. By the way, I already mentioned this at the very beginning, but semi-colonial Shanghai means that Shanghai was not under the control of any single national government. It was divided into separate Chinese and foreign jurisdictions And foreigners lived in these foreign concessions where they enjoyed immunity from Chinese laws, and this was known as extraterritoriality, and this was guaranteed by all these unequal treaties that China had to sign with the Western powers since the mid-19th century. So these two circumstances combined to make Shanghai a safe haven for Jewish refugees. Now the question is, and the question that in fact has been raised by historians, is to whom did the Jewish refugees owe a debt of gratitude? This is not an easy question to answer, in fact, given the circumstances that we just reviewed. We can pretty much rule out Chinese authorities because they weren't really in control. What about ordinary Chinese, ordinary residents of Shanghai? Now, this is actually a very difficult category to define because at the time, Shanghai was also overwhelmed by Chinese war refugees fleeing from fighting in the neighboring provinces. And there were about over 100,000 Chinese refugees who have crowded into these foreign concessions precisely because there was still a degree of freedom because they were still not, at the time, not under Japanese control. And so on top of this, you also have insuperable linguistic and cultural barriers between the Chinese and the Jews. So in fact, very few Chinese, ordinary Chinese, were in a position to help. And the answer to the question, in fact, is, in my view, other Jews. The refugees owed a debt of gratitude to other Jews, both local and international. And the most prominent of them is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, led by Laura Margolis. And in fact, this detail is mentioned in the novel. Now, I know historians are not fond of counterfactual questions, but I'm not a historian. And I also believe some counterfactual questions are very, very interesting to ask. And this question that I'm going to pose, I believe, is worth pondering, especially on the part of those Chinese, the Chinese government included, who are very quick to take credit for saving Jewish lives by pointing to the venerable Chinese tradition of benevolence, hospitality, and so on. Now, before I pose my question, let me quickly ask if any of you have heard of the Avian Conference of 1938? Only one person? Okay, we do need to explain what this is. So in 1938, President Roosevelt convened a conference of 32 nations to debate or to deliberate on the Jewish question. And to make a long story short, 31 of the 32 nations refused to open their gates or relax their quotas to let in untold numbers of destitute and desperate European Jews. So my question for you is, had China been a fully sovereign nation at the time, would China have behaved any differently from the 31 nations at the conference? The only exception being the Dominican Republic. And I will leave you to think about this question. Now, excuse me. To help you think about this question, I'm going to walk you through a historical detour. And I'm going to draw on the work of an Indian historian of China, my former mentor at Chicago, Prasenjit Dwara, on a contrasting phase of 19th century Chinese migrant laborers in Southeast Asia and the United States. In Southeast Asia, Chinese emigration dates all the way back to the 16th and 17th century, roughly coinciding with European colonialism. And this is a very important premise. The Chinese eventually came to occupy a niche status in the colonial economic and social hierarchy. They came to dominate the finance and trade sectors by serving as the European colonizers' favorite and trusted middlemen. Essentially, they constituted a disenfranchised outsider group who were economically successful but politically weak and vulnerable. And it is in this sense that they have been called the Jews of the East, sharing a fate very similar to Jews of Europe. And not surprisingly, in the post-colonial era, with the rise of nationalism, the ethnic Chinese, have become target of persecutions. And some of these pogroms and massacres against the Chinese, in fact, were sponsored by the newly independent nation states of Southeast Asia. And the most notable one, the most notorious one, was the 1965 Indonesian massacre of ethnic Chinese with a death toll of approximately 300,000. In fact, there was recently a documentary made about this event, this massacre. That was nominated for the Oscar. In contrast, in the United States, the Chinese migrant laborers in the 19th century met with a much harsher fate. Now, ostensibly, the U.S. Was and still is an immigrant society, an immigrant country in which citizenship is grounded in a set of political ideals enshrined in the Constitution. But we know that the United States at the time was already a nation state, independent nation state, no longer under British colonial domination. But the U.S. also had a very strong racist current at the time. So this is why we have the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was only repealed in the 1940s, and many anti-Chinese protests and riots. And this is what this background image shows. Now, the point of taking this historical detour is really to make a historical argument, the first part of my argument. That is, nation states, in fact, have a very poor humanitarian record and have by no means been the main driver, the main agents of humanitarianism around the world. On the contrary, nation states are chiefly responsible for wars of aggression, for genocides, and for massacres. Yet, the system of nation states has come to dominate has come to define our world order, and constitutes the most legitimate principle of state formation, to the sense that we no longer tolerate empires and other alternative forms of states. Likewise, nationalism has been the reigning ideology of our time, such that citizenship, political identity are profoundly bound up with mystical notions of blood and soil, and nations, as Benedict Anderson famously pronounced, might be imagined communities, but they are capable of inspiring profound love, dedication, devotion, and self-sacrifice from us. So this is an enormous paradox. And I think in order to explain this paradox, we need to turn to moral psychology, and that's what I will do next. And there's a Harvard psychologist named Joshua Green, who wrote a very influential book in which he compares morality, or he asks us to imagine our morality as a digital camera that comes with two settings, the factory setting, or the automatic settings, and the manual mode. The automatic settings, he says, are our moral intuitions or our moral emotions, such as fear, love, disgust, sense of fairness, righteous anger, and thirst for revenge. He says we are biologically wired with these emotions, but these emotions are also socially reinforced. In order to promote cooperation within close-knit groups, these automatic settings or our moral intuitions, they're very fast, they're efficient, they're mostly involuntary, but they're inflexible. And we experience them mostly at a subconscious level and tend to regard them as independent of our conscious will. And we have a name for this experience, and we call it our conscience. When we refer to something as our conscious, we're signaling that it goes without saying. It is beyond our conscious control. So an obvious example would be our aversion to harming others. We often invoke our conscience for our inability to do harm, or to say, stick a knife into a baby. We regard it as simply, it's simply right. It simply feels right. It requires no further justification. But some of us can indeed bring ourselves to doing such a thing, especially if the baby belongs to someone else, a stranger, an enemy. We are capable of such things. So Green believes that our point-and-shoot morality, our automatic, our hardwired morality has severe limitations, meaning it's restricted to the in-group, to the us. So we are capable of horrendous crimes against the out-group. So he says that's why we need the manual mode. The manual mode is our moral reasoning capacity. It's slow, it's inefficient, but it's flexible. And it is willing to engage in cost-benefit analysis, and is even willing to accept harm as a means if the end is justified. So some of us indeed can commit murder and so on when we believe that the end is justified. We can bring ourselves to overcome our automatic settings to do terrible things. Now, Green stresses the importance of the manual mode in overcoming the us versus them problem. But he doesn't quite address adequately how the manual mode, too, could be hijacked by organizations, corporations, bureaucratic institutions, and last but not least, nation states. These entities can take advantage of our manual mode and to tweak our automatic settings to align with their purposes, with their interests, such as to make a profit, such as to wage a war, such as to exterminate an ethnic group. So soldiers, spies, and assassins, for example, are often favored by these groups because they can be trained to turn off their automatic settings against killing and maiming in order to carry out their missions. And this is indeed the question of where does evil come from? And this is a question that Green does not address, but fortunately a philosopher and sociologist named Zygmunt Bauman has spent much of his academic career addressing, and that is his thesis of the social origins of evil. And he borrows a term from the ecclesiastical tradition called diaphoron, and this is a Greek term that refers to something that is religiously irrelevant, so that the church, or the Christian church, does not have to either endorse it or prohibit it. It just can be left alone. But he borrows this term and he coins the construction diaphorization to refer to the retreat of morality from modern life, meaning our tendency to take morality out of a situation, to to render something or some act morally irrelevant. So he says this is often accomplished through a mechanism he calls distancing. He says the modern division of labor and modern technology have made it possible for us, for people, to work with a tunnel vision, rarely having to confront point blank the consequences of our action. So we each get assigned a little task, and we're told just to do this little thing and do it well, and we don't have to worry about the large picture. We don't have to worry about the larger moral implications of our activity. And the distancing effect then leads to a kind of a shriveling of our moral capacities or moral relevance, and the attenuation of our sense of moral responsibility. And in modern life, sometimes this can lead to ghastly consequences. And his primary example is, of course, the Holocaust, where we are now familiar with the thesis of the banality of evil. Supposedly, the Nazis are just all these bureaucrats who are just doing their jobs. But of course, this is a very problematic thesis, and he challenges that thesis in a very effective way. But some people might regard this as a somewhat extreme example, and I think we can, in fact, just use war as our example to make sense of what he's trying to say. We all know that the entire disciplinary regime of the modern military is designed with an eye to blunt the moral impulse of individual soldiers. We don't want the soldiers to be constantly thinking about the moral implications of their action. We want them to nullify, in fact, their inner moral scruples against killing and maiming, because that is their job. Their job is to go and kill and maim. And we want them to numb their feelings of pity for enemies and the ensuing guilt they might have. But upon return, they are expected to turn their moral intuitions and emotions back on in order to reintegrate into civilian life, where they are expected to behave like normal human beings, like the rest of us. And it's no wonder that that our veterans have so much trouble adjusting to civilian life. Of course, today we readily recognize PTSD as an affliction that many of our veterans suffer. But we have a tendency to psychologize this condition so that we believe it's just it's the job of doctors and therapists, and the rest of us don't have anything to do with the veterans' troubles. But in fact, lately I've read a few articles in the media coming from both the psychological profession and veterans groups, saying that, especially the veterans, saying that we don't just want you, the civilians, to thank us for our service and then turn us over to the doctors and therapists. We need you to work our PTSD problems together, and you need to recognize that we come back not only physically broken and psychologically damaged, we're also morally compromised, and we need to go through a collective process of moral reckoning. And civilians need to acknowledge their moral complicity in what we do. So I think this is a very encouraging sign of development. In any case, the point I want to draw out of Zygmunt Bauman's discussion is that this idea of moral courage. Moral courage, I believe, should be distinguished from heroism, or what I'm calling here supererogatory heroism, meaning acting above and beyond the call of duty, in the manner of American Sniper. How many of you have seen American Sniper? To me, that's a very good example of a supererogatory heroism. Somebody who does his job and does extremely well. But I don't think it fits my definition of moral courage here. I'm not saying he's not courageous. Just I'm developing a very narrow definition of moral courage, which I believe must entail a kind of a breakthrough of or a reawakening of our moral intuitions, a heeding of the voice of conscience. And oftentimes this means acting contrary to organizational imperatives. So, in fact, there's a verb in English that describes this very well. That is whistleblowing. And so, whistleblowers are actually fit very well in my definition of moral courage. And so, looking at Chinese literature and Chinese history, I find, in fact, very few stories that would fit my definition here. There are lots of stories of heroisms, but very few about moral courage. And so that's why this novel, A Jewish Piano, caught my attention. So back to the novel and back to our question. And remember, the crucial episode that I told at the very end, the inventive story of Chinese generosity, how it turns a kind of a historical near miss into a humanitarian fantasy. So why should we take this made-up story seriously? Right? Now, I'm a literary scholar, so I am the last person to dismiss a story just because it's not factual. In fact, I find it even more interesting. And I believe, well, first of all, fiction is about what could or should have happened. And fiction, in fact, holds crucial insights into moral psychology. And there are, in fact, very interesting lessons that can be gleaned from fiction in general and, of course, this novel here. So let's think about this humanitarian fantasy story. Now, remember, Mei in Shanghai is an undercover agent working for the Red Army. Being an undercover agent means that you are, in fact, somewhat aloof from organizational supervision and discipline. You're temporarily detached from the chain of command. And this is a very interesting situation because it constitutes a kind of a enabling condition for Mei to exercise moral autonomy. So I have no trouble calling Mei a morally courageous hero, even though she's a fictional character. And for a couple of reasons. So she has, of course, to put her life on the line while she is running the humanitarian operation because she has to evade the gauntlets of Japanese patrols. But she also probably has to divert part of her operating budget for medical supplies to finance the relief operation. And the novel doesn't give us a lot of detail as to how she comes up with the money, but I imagine that she does have to use some of her own funds. And all of this she does without organizational approval, without the approval of her Red Army superior. And in doing so, she jeopardizes the cause of the Red Army, and she risks excommunication and even something worse. And her allegiance, when she is undertaking this operation, her allegiance to the communist nationalist cause, in fact, temporarily takes a back seat while she follows her moral intuition, acts as autonomous moral agent. And the same goes for her collaborators to some extent, but not quite the same. So you might say, well, but isn't she just motivated by love for Adam, romantic love? yes, this is in fact a very important factor to consider because her love for Adam takes her repeatedly to the ghetto to look for him. Otherwise, she would have no reason to go to the Jewish ghetto. And thanks to Adam, the Jews are no longer distant strangers or generic foreigners. And they are now neighbors in distress. She can see what life is like for these refugees. And she, in the fact that she has very little trouble mobilizing the Chinese residents, follows the same logic. The Chinese residents too have been living next door to the Jews. So Jewish lives have been thrown together cheek by jowl with Chinese lives. So for these residents too, the Jews are no longer distant strangers or generic foreigners. They are now neighbors in distress. And of course, Adam is still an important figure here. He, in fact, plays the role of a bridge character. This is a term often you'll encounter in psychological literature. A bridge character is a character that is a distinct individual, is a person with a face. Without this bridge character, we often have trouble in imagining the pain of others, and we can remain unmoved by faceless mass suffering. So Adam, as a bridge character, brings the Jewish refugees into the moral orbit of the Chinese, of May and her collaborators. And this is in fact a very familiar trope in Hollywood movies. In many Hollywood stories about some troubled spot in the third world, you'd have a bridge character who is either American, who's traveling in the city area, or a local English-speaking cosmopolitan person or native. Or sometimes you'd have both, and they are either lovers or they're close friends, and they work together to help the local people. And so I would say that what we have here in this invented story is a moral encounter. It's not a encounter in the sociological sense, meaning there was very little social interactions between the Chinese and the Jews. For obvious reasons, the Jews didn't venture out of the ghetto much, and the Chinese didn't really get to meet and befriend many Jews. There was no great friendship being forged in Shanghai, contrary to some of the claims in the official Chinese media. But we have a moral encounter in the sense that we have a person who enact what I'm calling a Levinasian moment of ethical transcendence. Levinas, of course, is a French Jewish philosopher famous for his theory of the face of the other. That is the key mechanism for summoning us to moral action. So here we have a Chinese person responding to the summons of the face of the other, of the Jews, and she rises to the occasion. And to that extent, this is a moment that will live on from here to eternity, as in fact the story of these real, actual Chinese humanitarians whose stories are well documented and indeed have lived on in our collective memory. If you're curious about who these people are, I'd be happy to explain in the Q&A session. So I'm going to wrap up now by returning to the story that I left out of my summary, that is Li Bo's journey. Li Bo is Mei's son, if you remember. So Li Bo decides that he wants to leave China in order to be reunited with his father, who now lives in America. He, through many efforts, he manages to join a medical team to Egypt. And he travels with the team to Egypt, where he defects by claiming to be a Polish refugee who has lost all his papers. So he's sent packed off to a refugee camp, and eventually he manages to steal onto a transatlantic ocean liner as a stowaway, and then a tropical disease kills him en route to America. So he never manages to reach American shore. If he were, he would be an illegal immigrant, would be lost in the bureaucratic maze of our INS, our esteemed INS, and he's still not guaranteed to be reunited with his father. But the question I want to leave you with is, why doesn't the novel give us a Hollywood ending, given that so much of the rest of the novel reads like a Hollywood story? Why don't we have the satisfaction of having Li Guo becoming reunited with his father, and perhaps even bringing his father to China and to be reunited with Mei? What does the novel want to tell us with this very, very tragic and very unsatisfying ending? So I'd be happy to elaborate on any of the points or answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.